They still talk about her in the high desert towns. The widow who rode out alone and came back with chains dragging behind her. No one heard her coming. No one saw her leave. But every soul who'd ever seen the embers in her eyes knew. If Eliza Crane had set her jaw toward something, not even God himself could turn her back. The sky that year was bone-dry and bruised with smoke. Red dust curled off the land like old ghosts, clinging to fence posts and burying hoof prints by noon. Eliza's ranch sat lonely on a patch of stubborn earth, the last decent waterhole 3 miles east, the canyon wall rising like a knife to the west. Her house was plain, sun-faded boards, a slanted porch, one broken shutter that never stayed nailed. Half the shingles on the barn had peeled up like scabs in the wind. Drought had taken most of her crop and all of her husband, and still she rose before the sun each day. Hands raw, boots worn thin. She rarely came to town. When she did, she spoke little, paid in coin or goods, and left before the gossip could settle. Folks called her Quiet Eliza, half in respect, half in pity. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way the saloon girls were, but there was something steel-bound in the way she moved, tight-lipped, tall-shouldered, and always with that glint of silver around her neck. Her mother's wedding ring, worn not on a finger, but on a fine chain that lay just beneath her collarbone. A private keepsake. A promise, maybe. The only softness she allowed herself. On the 7th night of July, just as the sun burned itself out behind the ridge, Eliza was coming in from the well when the wind shifted, and with it came horses. Not the lazy clop of ranchers, but the fast, cruel rhythm of riders who didn't knock. 5 of them, black scarves tied tight across their faces, guns drawn. Their laughter was dry and sharp, like glass breaking under booth heels. She dove behind the trough, clutching the Winchester she always kept nearby. But they were too fast. One tossed a kerosene bottle into the barn, then lit a match with his teeth. Flame bloomed like a hungry flower, leaping across the hay. The horses screamed and kicked inside before the roof cracked and collapsed. She bit her knuckle to keep from crying out. Smoke clawed at the sky. Ash stung her eyes. They took everything. Sacks of grain. Dried venison. Her husband's saddle. When they kicked in the door of the house, she could do nothing but press her face into the dirt and pray they wouldn't see the shadow she cast beneath the porch. One of them came out holding a yellowed Bible and laughed like it was a joke. Another smashed her wash basin. The third man, tall, long coat, silver conchos down the sleeve, strolled out last, flicking the end of a cigar and squinting toward the hills like he owned them. Jed Crowley. She hadn't seen Jed in nearly a decade. He'd been leaner then, faster, full of spit and dare. Now he looked wider, coiled like a man who'd killed too often to blink at the smell of smoke. And still, dangling between his fingers, was her mother's wedding ring. He'd found it where it hung inside her dresser, ripped it off the chain, slipped it on his pinky like it meant nothing. Eliza didn't make a sound. Not when they rode off. Not when the flames gutted what was left. She waited until the dark wrapped around her, until even the stars looked afraid to show their faces. Then she crawled out. Her boots crunched on scorched dirt. The barn was gone. Her best mare gone. Her food, her tools, her piece of safety gone. She stood where the ring had been taken, clutched the little space at her neck as if it still warmed her skin. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes weren't wet. She walked into the ruins of her home, picked through the wreckage, and pulled out what hadn't burned. A rifle, half a coil of rope, a worn ledger with old names written in tight, practice script, some crossed out, some not. She dusted it off, flipped to a page with a half-finished map, and stared at it for a long time. In the morning, no smoke rose from the ranch, only the outline of a woman on horseback, riding west into the red, where the canyon cut the land like a wound. She didn't leave a note, didn't ask for help, just packed what she had left and followed the trail where the dust still hung in the air. Folks said she just vanished into the wind, but the wind didn't carry her away. It sharpened her, took the soft edges, and scraped them down to bone and steel. The desert does that to people, if they let it. And Eliza Crane, who once kept to shadows and silence, let the wind take her apart. Then she put herself back together. By the 3rd day, her lips were cracked and her throat raw. The sun came down like a hammer, and every step felt like it might be her last. Her boots wore thin over jagged stone. The canteen was nearly empty. Still, she didn't turn back. She drank what little she could squeeze from cactus ribs. She tore cloth from the hem of her skirt and bound her bleeding feet. At night, the stars looked cold enough to cut. Coyotes watched her from the ridges, their eyes burning like coal in the dusk, but they kept their distance. Something about the way she moved, slow and steady, rifle strapped tight across her back, told even the wild things to stay clear. She slept in hollows carved by wind and time, with a rifle across her chest and her heart beating like a drum against the earth. There were moments, just before sleep claimed her, when she could almost hear the past. Gunfire echoing through narrow canyons, boots thundering down dry creek beds, the bark commands of men who'd long since gone to dirt. Elizabeth Shane. That was the name she'd left behind. Not Eliza Crane, the rancher's widow, but Shane the ghost, the marshal's eye, the woman who rode with Jack Grady and the federal posse out of New Mexico. Her legend was quiet but brutal. A woman who could shoot the wick off a lantern at 50 paces, who once tracked a killer across 3 states and brought him back in chains with his ear missing. Her badge was buried in a box beneath a cottonwood tree, wrapped in her wedding veil, the night she said yes to a man who promised peace. But peace didn't last. Peace had a heartbeat and a name, and the fever took him before the snow melted, and the desert, like time, waited for her return. Now it welcomed her. She crested a narrow ridge late that afternoon, the heat so heavy it bent the horizon. Below, a dried spring trickled just enough for a bird to bathe. She crouched low, letting the smell of water draw her forward. There, prints. Deep, wide, fresh. 5 horses. Boot tracks. One was heavier, dragging slightly. She knelt beside it, touching the dirt with 2 fingers. Still warm. She moved carefully, her breath held as if even the wind might betray her. A broken mesquite branch bore a black scrap of fabric, snagged on a thorn, scorched at the edges, tar-smelling, the kind of rag men like Jed Crowley used to wrap their faces. Nearby, the faintest trace of cigar ash curled against a stone like it hadn't decided to blow away yet. She kept moving. Her fingers brushed over dry grass, checking angles, wind direction, slope of hill. She noted the drag in one man's gait, the way the horses had been tied down too long, irritable hooves pawing at the dirt. She found a half-bitten jerky strip, thrown aside, salted the way gang riders liked, cured with too much pepper. Instinct took over, not the instinct of a ranch widow, but of a predator who had once worn a badge under her coat and knew how men like Jed thought. She moved with no wasted motion. She stopped often, listened more, and each hour that passed, she began to feel more like the woman she had buried. Near sundown, the wind carried the faintest hum of voices. Male, laughing, confident, unaware. She dropped to her belly, crawling through brush and shale until she reached the edge of a high bluff. The canyon below split wide like the back of a broken jaw. Jagged cliffs, scattered trees, the whisper of water from a narrow stream that fed into a shaded bend. 5 men lounged around a small fire, rifles stacked against a log. One cleaned his boot with a knife. Another swatted flies from a hunk of meat sizzling over the flames. Jed Crowley leaned back against a boulder, chewing a toothpick and spinning something between his fingers. The light caught it, glinting once, twice, like it was trying to scream in silence. Her mother's ring. There was no mistaking it. She felt it like a blade under the ribs. The way he spun it, carelessly, like it was no more than a lucky charm. He laughed at something another man said, reached for his whiskey, and the ring caught the firelight again, sharp, golden, defiant. Eliza did not move. She barely breathed. The wind shifted. The sun began to dip behind a canyon wall, bleeding red across the sky. And Eliza Crane, the woman they had called quiet, the woman they had robbed, began to plan how each one of them would fall. She stayed on that ridge until her legs went numb and the sky bled to black. Hours passed. Fires flickered. Shadows moved. She counted each of them. 5 shapes, 5 distinct cadences of movement, 5 different ghosts walking in the skins of men she remembered far too well. Jed Crowley slept with one boot still on, rifle within arm's reach, hat tipped low over his eyes like he'd never known fear. He had always fancied himself untouchable. To his left, Amos Finch, once a Union soldier turned bounty hound, now reduced to burning out ranchers for whiskey and sport. On the far side, Harry Bricks called and snored so loud the crickets paused. He was a deserter who once slit a man's throat for calling him coward. Jesse Pike, with his tattooed hands, liked to tie knots, particularly the hanging kind. The fifth, Lyle Beck, kept to himself, always quiet, always watching. He had the eyes of a starving wolf. She watched them eat, drink, piss, gamble, and argue. She watched how Finch always got up twice in the night to relieve himself, how Bricks kicked in his sleep, how Jed clutched a small pouch against his chest where he kept his stolen trophies. She waited, patient as dusk, until even the fire began to shrink. When the last snore settled into the canyon dust, she moved. Barefoot, silent, one step at a time. She slipped down the bluff like a wraith, every breath measured. The horses were tethered loosely on the canyon's edge. A mistake. These men were confident, drunk on violence and the false comfort of isolation. Eliza approached with slow hands and an old trick, a whisper into the ear of the lead mare, a touch to the flank, then a quick slap and release. The first horse bolted, then the second. Within a minute, 5 sets of hooves clattered off into the darkness, echoing like thunder. She didn't wait to see if they heard. Next came the boots. While the men slept, she slid between their scattered bedrolls, careful not to breathe too hard. Into Brick's boots, she poured ground cactus needles, sharp enough to draw blood, small enough to go unnoticed until morning. Jesse's bedroll was easier. She slid a coiled rattlesnake skin beneath his blanket, positioned just so the first roll of a restless leg would feel like scales against flesh. She was gone before the moon had crossed the canyon mouth. By the time the sky began to gray, the tension in the camp was palpable. She could feel it from her perch, movements sharper, tempers hotter. They shouted at each other, blamed coyotes for the missing horses. Jed spit curses into the wind, swore it was bad luck. But she knew better. She sat against a boulder and ran her fingers over the chain she wore coiled beneath her shirt, the one that had held her mother's ring. It was heavier now, meaner. A tool, not a token. The last time she had used it was a lifetime ago, when Jack Grady was still alive. Jack had been her partner, mentor, and the only man she trusted in those years riding for the marshal's office. He used to say revenge was a slow bullet. If you shoot too fast, you miss the pain. He told her one night, as they sat around a fire, not so different from the one below. Let it hurt, Lizzie. Let it chew through bone before you pull the trigger. She hadn't understood it then. She'd been too hot-blooded, too quick to run down every outlaw like they owed her something. But now she understood. The pain wasn't just the reason, it was the weapon. She waited until dusk fell again. The night was cool, and the fire smaller now. The men had lost their ease. They muttered in shorter sentences, their eyes constantly scanning the trees. One man, Finch, grumbled and wandered off behind a boulder, muttering curses about his gut. That was the moment she had waited for. She followed without a sound, watched him fumble with his belt, cursing the darkness, the heat, the itch in his boots. She stepped behind him like smoke, wrapped the chain twice around his throat, and pulled. He didn't get a scream out, just a grunt and a flail of elbows. He clawed at the chain, but she held firm, bracing her feet, leaning into the pull until he sagged. The body went slack in less than a minute. She kept pulling for another, just to be sure. Then she dragged him deeper into the brush, covered him with a bed of loose rock and dirt, and took his revolver. When she returned to her perch, the camp was quieter. For shadows, for voices, for men who didn't know they were already bleeding. In the pale hush of midnight, the canyon grew colder. Jed Crowley woke first, saw the horses gone, and Finch's bedroll still empty. His voice cut through the dark like a blade. "Where the hell is Amos?" No one answered. Bricks hissed as he pulled on his boots, yelped when the thorns dug in. Jesse leapt from his bedroll with a cry, throwing off the coiled snake skin and drawing his knife. Jed spun around, eyes sweeping the dark beyond the fire. "We're being hunted," he muttered, voice low, like the truth was something to keep quiet. Up on the ridge, Eliza loaded her rifle beneath the hush of the moonlight, her eyes steady, her breath slow. 1 down, 4 to go. By the second night, the fire burned lower and the men stopped sleeping in shifts. They were too tired to think straight and too afraid to admit it. With every whisper of wind or rustle of leaves, fingers twitched toward triggers. Eliza watched from above, steady as a hawk. The scent of fear was thick in the canyon, and she fed it like kindling. They argued over Amos's disappearance, Jed claiming he'd run, Bricks insisting he'd been taken. Jesse accused Lyle of sneaking off to warn someone, and Lyle almost shot him for it. Jed roared them back to order, but the fracture had spread like heat through old wood. They'd gone from predators to prey, and hadn't yet decided which one of them was the bait. Eliza worked the terrain like a cattle drive. Every noise she made, every rock she overturned, every glint of light where there shouldn't be one. Intentional. She left prints just visible enough to mislead. Lured them away from the creek, toward the higher rocks where there was no cover, no exits. She was shaping the canyon into a trap. By the next afternoon, the air shimmered with heat and bad decisions. Lyle wandered off to scout a ridge and didn't return. Eliza waited until the others had forgotten him, then set her ambush. The first trap was simple, a loose wire, rusted, looped low between 2 rocks near a ledge. Bricks came running after hearing a noise, just a clink, timed perfect. His boot caught the wire, and down he went, arms pinwheeling before he vanished off the edge with a short scream and a long silence. Next was Jesse. He was already spooked, muttering prayers, chewing tobacco like it might save him. He stumbled upon the second trap, a buried rifle rigged with a trigger line. He stepped on it without looking, and the thing exploded in his chest, flinging him back into a patch of cactus. Eliza watched from behind a juniper tree, her eyes flat as stone. Now there was only Jed. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just stood in the open clearing where the fire had once burned and waited, hands loose by his sides, revolver low on his hip. "You ain't clever," he called, voice echoing against the rock. "You're just mean." Eliza stepped out of the brush, rifle aimed low but steady. Her hat cast a shadow over her face, but he could see her eyes, sharp, cold, relentless. "Well," he sneered, "the widow come to weep? Gonna scold me for your horses." She fired once. The bullet struck the dirt inches from his feet. He flinched, then laughed, though the sound caught in his throat. "That it? Gonna shoot a man in the dirt? Ain't you got rules?" She said nothing, began walking forward slowly, the barrel still aimed his way. He stepped back, uncertain now, recalculating. "Wait, I know you," he said. "Not just from the ranch. No, I seen you before. Years back. Dodge. No, Lordsbug. Marshall's posse. That was you. The lady with the dead eyes." She kept walking. "You were one of the Marshalls," he growled. "Elizabeth Shane. Hellfire, I thought you was dead." "Almost," she said, her voice low. "But then you took my mother's ring." He drew. She ducked. His first shot missed wide, ringing off stone. Her shoulder hit the dirt, and she rolled, came up with the rifle steady, and fired. The shot clipped his arm. He roared, dropped the revolver, and charged. She didn't move until the last second, let him get close, then cracked the butt of the rifle across his temple. He staggered, blood seeping down his cheek. He lunged again, wild now. They crashed into the dirt together, fists, elbows, knees. She fought like someone who had bled for justice and survived the grave it left behind. Jed tried to wrap his hands around her neck, but she bit his thumb, jammed her knee into his ribs, and scrambled free. She reached for her rope, looped it once, twice, and threw it over his head. He thrashed, screamed, cursed her mother, her husband, her past. She yanked hard, dragged him down, pressed her boot into his back, and tightened the knot. The ring clinked against the chain around her wrist. He spat into the dirt. "You should have stayed dead." She leaned in, breath steady. "You should have stayed in prison." He coughed. "This won't change nothing. You still lost." She stared at him, at the blood, the spit, the hate, and then at the little gold ring glinting in the dirt. She picked it up gently, as if it might break from all it had seen. She didn't speak, just brushed it off and slipped it back onto the chain around her neck. It nestled there like it had never left. Her hands trembled, not from fear or rage, but from something older, something hollow and deep and full of the things she couldn't get back. The sun dipped low behind the canyon. The wind finally sighed through the rock, soft as breath. She stood alone in the silence, with her ghosts behind her and a man in chains at her feet. A week after the fire, she came back through the canyon pass, not alone, but dragging a devil behind her. The sun rose behind her like a furnace, casting long shadows over the dust-choked trail. Chains rattled in rhythm with her boots. Jed Crowley stumbled behind her, wrists bound, face bruised and cracked like dry earth. He cursed every step, but not loud. Not anymore. The fire had gone from him. Whatever he'd stolen, whatever he'd burned, Eliza Crane had taken something worse from him in return. By the time she reached the edge of town, her silhouette had drawn a dozen eyes. By the time she crossed the Dry Creek bed, half the town had gathered to watch. Horses stopped mid-trot. Men lowered their cigars and tipped their hats without thinking. A woman on the hotel porch whispered, "That's her." Like it was church. Sheriff Barton stepped out of his office, spitting chew into the dirt. His jaw worked once, twice, then stilled when he saw the man in chains. "Jed Crowley," he said, voice high and brittle. Eliza didn't answer. She reached into her coat, pulled something from her pocket, and dropped it onto the sheriff's desk with a dusty clack. It was the old badge Jed had worn like a trophy, wrenched from the ribs of a deputy 2 years back. Stained, bent, now returned. She didn't wait for Barton to catch up. She walked past him, past the stables, past the general store, through the middle of a silence that felt too large for the town to hold. Some folks watched the outlaw. Others just watched her. In the hush, children tugged at their mother's sleeves. "Who is she?" "Elizabeth Shane," one woman whispered. "Used to ride for the marshals, before she got married." "Eliza Crane," another said softly. "Widow on the hill." "They're the same," someone muttered, and the name began to shift in the mouths of those who'd once pitied her. By sunset, the whispers had turned to stories. They said she'd tracked 5 men across the desert with no food and 1 bullet. They said she'd strangled the killer with the chain he tore from her neck, that she dragged Crowley through 10 miles of thorns and didn't speak a word until the badge hit the table. At the mercantile, a clerk told a wide-eyed boy. She tied up the outlaw using only rope and her own blood. On the chapel steps, a pair of sisters repeated the tale that she didn't blink when he drew, that her rifle never missed, that her mother's ring had glowed in the moonlight like fire from heaven. Women stood taller that night. Doors stayed unlocked a little longer. One young girl, no older than 10, followed Eliza across the square until Eliza stopped, knelt, and said only, "Go home, sweetheart. Make your own story." And that child would. The sun sank behind the hills, and for the first time in days, the wind carried something gentler than smoke. Eliza walked alone back toward the edge of town. Her coat flapped loose at the hem, her hair streaked with dust and sweat. The ring swung gently on its chain, warm against her skin. The badge she'd buried long ago was still in her pocket. She didn't know yet what she would do with it. They took everything. She gave them justice. And no one ever stole from quiet Eliza again.